This is Henry Frederick of Headline Surfer, and this is the Roundtable, a weekly discussion of news and public affairs. To my left is Stan Escudero, who writes a blog called The Guidepost, and to my right is Dana Dougherty Swanson, who writes a political blog called Dana's Docket. This week we're going to talk about a few topics. So topic number one this week is looking at the fallout from the fiscal cliff. And apparently the two sides were able to get together after all at the last minute. Surprise, surprise. But nobody seems to be happy with the end result anyway. Stan, tell us about the situation now where Obama basically wants to rewrite the law to benefit him.
Well, what's happening is basically the same thing that happened last summer. It's necessary to raise the debt ceiling if the United States is to continue to borrow money to fund its government activities. If it stops borrowing money, it can still pay the interest on the debt from the taxes it receives, but it would have to cut back on some 40% of its expenditures, which would be very difficult for the government to do. So there will be a raise in the debt ceiling. But the question is on what terms? The Republicans are very wisely insisting that the problem is one of spending, and if you're going to raise the debt ceiling, you must also reduce spending so that we don't keep adding to the debt and adding to the debt until we collapse the economy. Mr. Obama, on the other hand, who wants to collapse the economy so that he can become a Marxist tyrant, is refusing to consider anything of the sort and is saying, I must have the authority myself, without respect to Congress and contrary to the Constitution, to raise the debt whenever I feel like it, borrow more money in as great an amount as I want, whenever I feel like it, and once I get that, then I'll talk to you with some unspecified future date about some possibility of cutting spending and so forth, like they just cut with respect to the fiscal cliff. That is to say, they cut spending by $12 billion in reaching the fiscal cliff, in reaching the agreement on the fiscal cliff, but they increased spending by 41 times $12 billion, moving us further and further down the road toward collapse.
Dana, based on, Stan gave a very eloquent summary, but for the average person out there, what's the reality of all this?
Well, basically, like with the fiscal cliff, I mean, all of us saw our paychecks go down just recently. I mean, as of the new year.
Like $500 a person or something like that.
Well, I think it all depends between $80 to plus dollars a month. It just.
But I mean annually, like.
Annually, because the thing is, our Social Security payroll taxes increased by 2%. So that means we're taking home 2% less each month. And that was even on the money that we earned post-January, if it was the first paycheck of the year. Yeah, if it was earned in December, you got 2% less. How many of us can afford 2% less? How many Americans have not had a pay raise in years because of how bad the economy, but our income keeps getting chipped away because of, once Obamacare was passed, our health insurance went up. So that means less take-home pay. Now the Social Security payroll taxes, that means another 2% out of our paychecks. How many people are teetering on a fiscal collapse now? How many American families? And yet the government, as Stan is saying, is that Obama just wants to keep spending. He's not willing to make a sacrifice, but all the American people are being sacrificed.
Well, Stan, in terms of, Dana's talking about families and struggling. What about the employers? What incentive is there to invest if their taxes are going up like this? They already pay a majority of the taxes to begin with. Whether or not they have the money or not, I think doesn't really matter. The point is if they're not going to have the money to invest, if all they're going to do is be penalized by paying taxes, what's the incentive to invest?
Well, obviously what Obama is doing is harmful to employers. It's harmful to the private sector in general, but then Obama is a Marxist, and he believes in government control of the means of production, if not outright ownership, at least control. And so it doesn't disturb him philosophically.
But doesn't this also mean that
his policies are gutting what is the very core of our economic prosperity in this country? I mean, what is it doing for employers? It's forcing them to pay a great deal more money under Obamacare for their employees, for the health care. And so what they're doing is they've got lawyers too, They look at Obamacare and they say, aha, this only applies to full-time employees. So all of a sudden, so many of their full-time employees are getting their work time cut back, and now they're becoming part-time employees, which means less money for the employees, but it saves money that the employers would have had to have spent under Obamacare. They would have given to the government. Now they don't have to. But do they invest? No. The businesses in this country are sitting on some $2 trillion in investable money, which they're afraid to invest because they don't know what Obama is going to do with taxes. And they're right not to know. You would think, because Obama just won this battle with the Republicans over raising taxes only on the very wealthy and letting everyone else continue on with the Bush tax cuts, you would think he would be satisfied. Although there is a basic contradiction there, since the Democrats have been saying for several years that the Bush tax cuts were a horrible thing and were contributing to reduced revenue. And then they suddenly fought to keep those tax cuts in place for almost everybody, except for those paying about $62 billion more, enough to fund the government for about 6.5 days on an annual basis. Now that Obama has that, you would think he might be satisfied, and he might turn, if he were a responsible president, to the question of the debt ceiling, the deficit, and the overall level of debt. But he's not doing that. He is refusing to discuss that, and he is saying straight out, oh, we aren't through creating taxes. There are going to be more taxes. There's going to be more revenue. We're going to tax you indirectly, for example, by reducing various kinds of deductions and other types of things that really wealthy people use. But he will very soon figure out that there's not enough money to be gained by just reducing the deductions that the wealthy use, and then he will come after the rest of us. And we will see things like, deductions for mortgage interest, which is a major supporter of the housing market in this country, go the way of all flesh.
But Democrats complain, all seem to agree, at least more recently, that the Bush tax were actually pretty good. And the second point that I want to...
That's exactly my point.
Right.
They were saying for years
Well, that's what I was trying to say.
and now suddenly they're good.
But the second point I wanted to ask you about quickly is, how does this stop? I would think this would enhance or make quicker big corporations say, you know what, I'm going overseas. Why stay here with all these taxes?
And the economy will collapse even sooner, and it will fulfill
Am I wrong
Obama's
about
goals.
that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, Henry, you have
They're
a
on
point.
the tariffs to
And
stop it.
that may well happen, because if you take a look at some of the other tax increases that he has already imposed, you see that capital gains taxes increase, taxes on income earned from dividends increase, and this is investment income. This is money that people with a little spare cash invest in companies. It's money which individuals who make quite a bit of money also invest, because tax levels are lower, but those investments are what fuel the activity of the private sector, which creates new wealth and creates jobs and basically enables our country to grow. Obama's policies are designed to prevent that. And as that happens, you're quite right, it pushes companies out of the country and to other places where the tax and permit and regulatory structure is more welcoming.
Well, Dana, if you have Obamacare, and especially next year when it'll become where you don't have to even have, you go to a hospital whether you can afford it or not, it's going to be paid for. I would think that investing overseas might be worth it more than ever, some of these big companies, non-oil companies, for, telecommunications and that kind of thing. You don't have to be based here anymore because of the global economy and the technology. What about that?
I think so, because they're going to look at America as weak and that poor investment, so go elsewhere, go to other economies that are going to be more like America used to be, because that's where you're going to have your return on investment.
Well, we'll be back with our second segment. Okay, we're back with segment 2 with Stan Escudero and Dana Doherty Swanson. And here we're talking about the situation in Syria. Dana, over 90,000 civilians dead. countless more unaccounted for. The war seems nowhere ending in sight in Syria. Tell us about the human toll.
Well, the thing is, unfortunately, is that I think so many countries, it's like people, history repeats itself. You see in areas where there's this mass war and death and destruction, and people forget about the humanity, and it becomes just a war zone, and people just become used to that. It's like almost violence becomes like second nature to them. I mean, that's when you get...
It's like reality TV, the videos that are coming out of there. It's so surreal.
Well, yeah, you look at like if you ever see like the soldiers being filmed and whatnot, it's just like, I think it was someone talking Syria where they're saying, you always bring a bullet for yourself as well, because you don't want to get captured.
Stan, tell us about...
Kipling addressed that.
Stan, tell us about the efforts diplomatically to bring pressure upon Bashar al-Assad to say, you know what, your time has come, get out.
Well, that's been tried in several different ways, ineffectively by the United Nations.
What incentive is there for him to stay? Why stay on? What is there?
Because he believes, I think correctly, that if he leaves, he will find himself prosecuted for war crimes, and if those who replace him in Syria, who will not be Alawite but will be Sunni Muslims, if they ever get their hands on him or any other members of the senior Alawite rulers, they'll be executed.
But his wife was from London, England, or educated, I guess she's a native of England. Couldn't England take them, or couldn't France, or even the United States?
I suppose anybody who wanted to could offer him asylum, but I don't see us doing it, and I don't see the Brits or the French doing it. The Saudis might.
They don't want that on their territory.
But once again, the man is an Alawite. He's not exactly.
Now, what's an Alawite?
Alawites are a sort of weird offshoot of Shia Islam, not Sunni Islam, and they are.
Are they the minority rule?
Oh yeah, they're a small minority of
Kind of
Syria.
like Saddam was.
Yeah, kind of like. But they have absolute control, or have had, of Syria for quite some time. If I were Bashar al-Assad and I were looking for a place to go, I would look to Iran. The Iranians have been the major external support of Syria throughout this revolution. They've provided arms, they've provided Pasdaran experts, fighters, and advisors for the Syrian army. And they have the most to lose. Iran, of the external countries, have the most to lose if Bashar al-Assad falls, and the Alawite rule is replaced by Sunni rule, because the Iranians, of course, are Shia.
So what's the incentive for Iran? I noticed there was a recent exchange of prisoners where 1,200 rebel soldiers were let go by the government of Syria in exchange for the rebels turning over a few dozen Iranian sort of advisors that were supposedly there on peaceful diplomatic reasons, which everyone knows is a farce. What's Iran's stake in all this?
Well, once again, Iran has worked closely with the Syrian government for decades now. They have helped to further Iranian interests in support of various terrorist groups operating out of Lebanon, primarily Hezbollah. They have also provided some assistance indirectly to Hamas and others in the Gaza Strip, from Iran through Syria to Gaza. And they have, with Syria, helped to dominate much of Lebanon ever since the Lebanese civil wars. And Iran would lose its major ally in the Arab world if Bashar al-Assad falls and is replaced by the Sunnis. But you need to consider Russia also.
Russia's a strong ally.
Russia has been the primary patron of Syria since well back into the Cold War, since the days of Bashar's father, Hafiz al-Assad. And
going back to the '67 Arab-Israeli war area.
Yes, exactly. And the Russians have the use of the Syrian port of Tarsus, which is a substantial naval port. This is their only real warm water port in the Mediterranean. They don't want to lose that. And they can be pretty sure, given their close relationship with the al-Assad family and with Alawite rule of Syria that the new Sunni government of Syria won't let them keep that. So they have a concern also, and that's one of the reasons why you see them in the United Nations working against fierce sanctions against the al-Assads and so forth.
Well, let me ask you this, Dana, and then you can defer to Stan if you feel it's more appropriate for him, but Israel, it's getting ramped up. At some point, Israel will discover that Iran is that much closer to nuclear capability, and they'll strike. With the situation in Syria being the way it is, does this have the potential to explode the Middle East all over, where it's just like, we've got troops and equipment now in Turkey. What's the Israeli factor in all this? Is that the X factor?
My opinion, I think so, because I think Israel, I believe it used to be the United States was much more of a friend to Israel than what it is now under President Obama, and I think Israel was kind of stuck right in the middle, and unfortunately with Iran getting close to nuclear capability, I wouldn't want to be them.
What about that, Stan, as the last word?
I don't see Israel getting involved in the struggle in
But
Syria.
indirectly, if they strike Iran,
this is a whole different thing. First, we're going to have to see if Netanyahu gets reelected. Assuming that he gets reelected, then I think the likelihood of an Israeli strike against Iran is good. I think that it's quite likely that Israel will strike at that time of their choosing. Whether or not they would want to let the Syrian conflict sort of provide a little cover for that.
That's what I mean.
I don't know. I couldn't. I couldn't.
What better timing than when everybody's?
But it would be something which they would do. After all, they said, if you remember when Netanyahu was here, and he drew that little diagram with the bomb, and they're this close and so forth. He said he thought maybe sometime between April and June.
Right.
That might be the time frame. I imagine that Mr. Netanyahu meant what he said, and that they will take a very close look at it in that time frame. And if it appears, as it must, that the Iranians are moving closer to the development of a bomb, then I think probably the Israelis will get about setting a schedule for action. But I don't think they want to get involved in the Syrian affair at all. That just takes away resources that they would use against Iran on time.
But if Israel strikes Iran, well, Iran and the rest of the Middle East, and even the superpowers, Russia and the United States, are focused on Syria. What better time to strike than when their resources are turned into there? And in effect, wouldn't it actually maybe stop what's going on in Syria?
Well, it might very well stop it because
they'd have to redevote their resources.
Something like that could cause the Syrians to stop fighting in order to take action against Israel. I mean, the thing you have to recognize is that while the Arabs, the Muslims, are constantly at one another's throats.
There's a common enemy in Israel.
Yeah. Once Israel reaches out to swat one of them, all of them immediately turn from fighting one another and turn toward Israel. And so the Israelis are going to have to be very careful at that point. It would probably be a lot better for them if the Syrian conflict were over by the time they struck. Not to say that Israel will necessarily have a good relationship with whatever follows Bashar al-Assad, because these Sunnis are also not a single united group. And there are among them, among their warlords who are fighting Bashar, there are a number of real radical jihadists. And we cannot be sure, nobody can know at this stage, which of the members of the opposition leadership, the rebel leadership, are going to be the government, or are going to actually have the power and rule.
Well, that'll conclude section 2. So we're back to segment 3 with Stan Escudero and Dana Doherty Swanson. Briefly, Stan and Dana, the situation in Mali, in Africa. The French have been quiet for quite a few years now, quite a few decades actually, and now they're starting to demonstrate some might in Mali, where they want to restore order and stop the Islamic jihadists from getting a foothold. Tell us a little bit about that, Stan, very, very briefly.
Well, very briefly, Mali was part of the old Afrique Occidentale Française, the large colonial structure that the French maintained until well after the Second World War in West Africa. And so the French have taken, as the former colonial power, the primary responsibility for development aid and for economic investment and that sort of thing throughout their former colonies in West Africa, with greater and lesser success depending on which area you're talking about. Mali is it's a very poor country which has had a rather glorious intellectual past in terms of Islamic thought. It is an Islamic country, but it is an early form of Islam coming into Africa, which is largely animist. Of course, I've been there. Which is largely animist, and what you're seeing now are two things. The first rising against the government was by the Tuareg. The Tuareg are sort of semi-Berber people who are nomadic and live in the Sahara. They're also Muslim, but different kind of Muslim, and they generally don't care for the settled governments of the capitals and the villages. They've been at daggers drawn with them over the years many times, against the French too. Beaugest was fighting Tuaregs. And then the Tuaregs were kind of pushed aside by Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, in the Western Sahara. That is, those who are far more radical, far more jihadist in their views, who are associated with, but distantly,
And that's why they had
the
to step
overall
in.
Al-Qaeda structure. And they came in, and it looked like they were going to be the ones who would come out ahead. They are the ones who've been making the advances recently. The French obviously do not want to see Mali become a hotbed of jihadist activity. And so they are moving, at the request of the government in Bamako, to strike against these rebels. And the bombings have begun. I don't know what the result is. I don't know, I have no idea whether the French are thinking of putting in the Foreign Legion or anything of the sort.
Well, David, Bamako, never heard of it. I've heard of Timbuktu, and I know that's a city in Mali, but the French for decades have been kind of the laughing stock as far as a superpower. You think they want to flex a little bit of muscle in the world now, or you think that this is something that will fizzle in short order?
Well, I never really thought of them as a laughing stock. I just saw them as kind of not really there,
Well,
so that's the way I looked at it. So, I mean, it's good that they're trying to step up to make sure that this is not a hotbed of jihadist influence in Mali, but I'm not sure how much they're going to be trying to fight on the world stage.
Well, it's kind of funny, Stan. You've got Mubarak about to go back on trial or sentencing. And he's 80-something years old, and he's like the walking of the sleeping dead. You've got the situation in Mali, you've got the situation in Syria. The Islamic extremists are just all over the place now.
Well, they are, but that doesn't mean they're being particularly successful anywhere. They're good at fighting, at making trouble, at blowing things up. They're not very good at managing, at running things well. But the French have some issues here. I mean, quite apart from whether or not they can project enough military power to enable the Malian government to win in Mali, they have to be concerned also about the reaction of the really very large numbers of Muslims who live in France. Especially in southern France. A majority of the youth between the age of, say, 20 and 40 in southern France is Islamic immigrant from North Africa. That's especially true in cities like Marseille.
It's going to sound naive, but isn't this all part of like the Moors that came into southern Europe with the Islamic?
Well, it's the same kind of thing. It's just that the Moors came in, on horseback with an army.
Right.
And these folks are coming in.
But they were Islamic too, weren't they?
Well, of course.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But isn't in most countries, the one country that doesn't seem to have an influx of Islamic immigrants is Japan? Isn't that true?
I am not aware that they do, but then they don't have any Islamic countries which are terribly near to them.
And they're
Yeah.
an island country too.
Well, also I think they tend to dissuade that. Just something I was read about.
Before we get too far, we'll end this segment, and then we'll be back for our fourth and final segment.
Right. So
we're back with our fourth and final segment for the roundtable. This time we're going to stick to something local for a final thing, and that is the swearing in, the recent swearing in of the new county council last Thursday. Stan, you were there, I was there. Tell us your impression of, there were quite a few players there from the community.
Well, indeed there were. I think it was of more than normal interest to the community because the nature of the council, the makeup of the council is changing. There is a certain balance on the council now between the two parties. Now, this is a new thing for Volusia County in the past generation. And I think everybody is interested to see how this will play itself out. And if they were there the first day, I think what they saw was a very smooth, genteel performance on the part of all parties.
Now, in 2012, we had one Republican, Joey Alexander, representing Southeast Volusia. Now it's 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans, with Jason Davis as the chair from Edgewater, Republican. Deb Denny's, the Republican from New Smyrna Beach. And the 3rd Republican being Pat Patterson, representing the land area.
District 1.
Yeah. So you got 3 new faces, but not really new faces in terms of Patterson. What about that makeup, Dana? How do you see things shaping up with that 4-3?
Well, even though it's not
Nonpartisan,
it's
but
nonpartisan,
doesn't
but
really mean much.
but the thing is, even though it's still a Democrat majority, I think it's that having 3 Republicans will be much more of a voice for sound government. That when there is something that is inappropriate, you're going to have 3 voices standing up for it and making a stronger case for sound government, fiscal responsibility, so that it's not just one party, it's going to be a balance.
Now, Stan, 2 things that struck me as interesting on Thursday, 2 particular actions. One, well, on Thursday at least, the county council, was the Jason Davis sticking to his fiscal promise to the county as a whole, that he would not approve anything that was not absolutely necessary for public safety, or things like to help poor people that are starving, or things for the blind, or special interests that are important, that all society expects government to help. He's $20,000 in the positive in terms of a recent what he called a bailout for a local charity in the chamber, where there was a competition of baseball, bringing in a couple of major league players, Brawl on the Beach. And it didn't work out the way people thought it would. Albert Pujols was supposed to be here, and it didn't work out. But Davis stuck to his guns, even though they were outvoted 5-2. Deb Denny's spoke with me, and I asked her about it, and she realized in hindsight that had she known that the Molina brothers, Yadi and his 2 brothers, Jose and Benji Molina, who was with the Texas Rangers, and the other one with the Tampa Rays, that $153 million worth of contracts in Major League Baseball doesn't quite fit so well when you've got an allotment of $20,000 in local taxpayer money. But Jason Davis stuck to his guns. How long can he do that, Stan, before he has to compromise, you think?
Well,
Or does he?
I think it depends on how the county council approaches the issues. First of all, compromise is going to be necessary on all sides to get anything done. And that's the way government should work. But secondly, with specific respect to this issue, I think everybody can agree that it was badly handled. And the chamber has promised that it won't happen this way again. One hopes that's true. I think Jason was right to stick to his guns, but I also think there was some utility, since the vote was going to go that way anyway. I think there was some utility in having it happen so that the business community can see that the council is prepared to work with them in moments of necessity, but not to give them a blank check. I think that's very important, because the business community is going to have to be the catalyst which fuels the development which is going to come in Volusia County. Much is going to be demanded of them in the next few years, and they're going to have to deliver. And they're going to have to be able to do it largely on their own with new wealth that they generate, operating in conditions which the council helps to create. So there's going to have to be a close cooperation between the two. And it's just very important to establish basis of confidence early on. I think $20,000 is not too high a price to pay for that. That said, how long can Jason do this? Jason is a man of his word. Jason is not a politician. He doesn't have vast ambitions to move on to some higher position. He's interested in helping to correct the problems that Volusia County faces and helping it to avoid bankruptcy down the road a few years.
But he's not as naive in this. I'll be the first to admit that I didn't have a lot of expectation if he got in that he would be able to be effective, but I've been impressed. Let me ask you this, Dana. I interviewed the vice chair of the at-large council member.
Oh, you mean Joyce Cusack?
Yeah. I had the pleasure of interviewing Joyce Cusack, the at-large county council member from DeLand, who actually is a native of New Smyrna Beach, as people know, former state legislator, pro tem, whatever it's called, of the House, second-ranking Democrat. A really big force to reckon with. But at 70 years old, she comes off her term in 2 years, term limited. Can she still, you think, be a force for Jason, a potential foe for Jason in 2 years later? Or do you see someone like Josh Wagner? Because I can't think of anybody else in the Democratic circles. Pat Northey is going to be term limited, but I don't see her. Well, maybe she could. What do you think, Stan? There's three right there.
Well, I think that the struggle within the Democrats to challenge Jason when his first term ends will be, at this point, if it's between somebody who's on the council, it'll be between Josh Wagner and Pat Northey. Well, that's my supposition at this stage.
Dana, you're from DeBarry. You're plugged in on the Republican side. Is there any talk about who might be a potential challenger for Jason Gates at this point, or is it too early?
It's been a little too early. I think no one's really mentioned because he's so new. No one's yet really, I think everyone's just, the election's been so recent, everyone's just trying to kind of lick their wounds over some of the, about Obama being reelected and things like that no one's really brought up a new opponent regarding that yet.
I'll tell you, there is one thing, though, that comes out of this vote on Thursday, this $20,000 vote, which I think is significant. That issue came before the council, and it was voted on. Bang, bang. I think that's a mistake, and I hope the council learns from this. I would urge the council not to address any fiscal issue without taking the time to study it.
Before you go any further, I will tell you this on the record. I was very impressed with Deb Denny's in terms of acknowledging that she screwed up. It was her first vote. There's a lot of pressure. It's a swearing-in day. But she did come back with something I thought that was very instrumental, and that is we need to fully vet these things. We need to have a stronger... And she told me, she said, Henry, if you could look it up on the internet on what a ball player was making, maybe I should have my laptop with me looking these things, checking these things out. What about the idea of government maybe moving too fast because some big shot comes up and says, hey, I need this money?
Well, I think that's exactly my point. I think the council, especially since you have a number of new members on the council now, the council needs to take the time to be deliberate in its actions, to make sure that they understand the ins and outs of some of these issues. For example, I don't know what the relationship is or was in terms of this contract or whatever arrangement the chamber may have had for the support of this charity. It may be that the council had some kind of obligation.
No,
or would have had some legal issue. I don't know whether they do or not.
Neither. It was totally...
Okay.
And that's why there needs to be some time
Right.
in between, because if, like Sam's saying, if you're doing bang bang, you need to be able to fully vet. You need to be able to have county council members be able to investigate or ask people, constituents, what do you think? Things like that when it comes to fiscal issues. And you can get caught up in a presentation at that time and think, okay, this sounds like a good idea, but once you start peeling back the layers, you go.
And if they do it that way, Henry, it will reduce the impact of partisanship.
Well, that's true.
Because it will give time for all the members to think about an issue. The knee-jerk response, of course, is to vote Republican or Democratic. It's always the case. But if the 7 members of the council have an opportunity to think about the issue and how it impacts the area for which they're responsible and how it impacts the county as a whole, then what you're going to have is the development of coalitions, which will vary depending on the issue, for each issue. And there needs to be time for that. There needs to be time for the members who vote to have a full understanding of the issue that they're voting on, and they need to understand how that plays with the other members. If that happens, you're going to have a lot of compromises which are based on substance, not on party. And that's just terribly important for an organization like the county council in Volusia County.
Well, I will say in wrapping up this final segment that I found it rather positive that both Deb Denny's a Republican and Pat Northey a Democrat, even though they both voted for this. Once I explained to them some of the issues with the salaries of the ball players and that kind of thing, Pat Northey was very clear, very humble, that I had this gnawing feeling that something just wasn't right. And then to give her credit as a Democrat, she too came up with a proposal at that very meeting of tabling a whole bunch of chicken dinner type events, suppers, dinners, charity things, where for years these have just been doled out to community groups because it's a politically correct thing to do. And they're realizing that, hey, look, you're talking $30,000, $35,000 worth of spending that
Yes.
maybe doesn't need to be there, and not in these economic
You
times.
see what I mean?
Exactly.
So for Dana Doherty Swanson, a Republican, and for Stan Escudero, a Republican, this is Henry Frederick. This has been the Roundtable, and we've enjoyed presenting this to you on Headline Surfer, accessible through headlinesurfer.com, nsbnews.net, and volusianews.net. And don't forget to check out our weekly Sunday conversation. Thank you.